And every morning before court, I would go to the gym in Union Square. And Union Square in San Francisco is like Fifth Avenue in New York. It's where all of the big, flagship stores are for the American brands like Nordstrom's and Bloomingdale's and Macy's and Gap and Old Navy and Levi, and all the big foreign brands like Gap, like Gucci and De La Valle and Prada and Burberry and Ferragamo, and they all have these giant stores there. Well, when I went back a month ago, all of those stores were closed. Oh, it's just acre after acre of plywood. It's like as if all of Fifth Avenue shut down. People come from all over the world to shop there, and it's gone. The economic heart of that city has been torn out. And it was such a traumatic experience for me seeing this. I love San Francisco. It's the most beautiful city in our country. It's my favorite city. And so I started studying homelessness because I didn't know much about it. So I started reading the books. My son, Connor, who's 28 years old and just graduated law school, he turned me on to a writer called Matthew Desmond. And Matthew Desmond has written a seminal work on homelessness, which is called Evicted. It's a best-selling book. But he's done all of these studies, and he did them with the University of San Francisco. And he went out and actually interviewed with this big team from the University of San Francisco. He interviewed thousands of homeless in San Francisco, and he gave questionnaires to them. And when I approached this issue, I came in with a series of assumptions and biases. And one of those was that homelessness was a feature ultimately of drug addiction. I also thought it's also linked to mental illness and to extreme poverty. And also I assumed that a lot of the people who were homeless in San Francisco had gone homeless somewhere else, like Detroit or New York, and they didn't want to sleep in the snowstorm on the grates. So they moved, they use their last couple of bucks and take a bus to San Francisco. And San Francisco is, of course, a better climate, but also a famously generous social service system. I'd also heard from many people in San Francisco that police in towns like Austin and Dallas, when they arrest a homeless person, when they pick him up, instead of bringing him to the county jail, they put him on a Greyhound to San Francisco with a one-way ticket. A lot of people in San Francisco believe that. So what Desmond's study shows is that the people who are homeless in San Francisco are from San Francisco overwhelmingly. So they didn't come from somewhere else. He also shows that there's parts of this country like West Virginia and Detroit which have much higher levels of drug addiction, but they don't have homelessness problems. And he also, and they also have much higher levels of poverty. San Francisco is the wealthiest city in our country. He also shows that, yes, many people who are homeless are mentally ill, but overwhelmingly they became mentally ill after they became homeless. He shows that after only 3 days on the sidewalk, your psyche begins to deteriorate, to disintegrate. And what he says, and he shows with data, is that the one correlation to homelessness is housing prices. And California has the highest housing prices in the country. And what Desmond says is that this epidemic that we see of homelessness in San Francisco is building like a tsunami and is about to roll across our country and bring the same level of homelessness, but also the same levels of disintegration. The reason all these places shut down is because of the chaos on the street, because people don't want to shop there anymore because there's these homeless encampments everywhere. And that same phenomena is about to happen to the rest of the country because the price of housing is skyrocketing.
Was there anything that just was perfectly said that made things click for you?
I mean, I said this the other day in an interview that one of the things that really helped me was a line from Isaiah that said, "Be still and know that I am God." Which, because my life was all activity and no progress. I was,
Mm.
I was ambitious and I was energetic and I put, huge energy into my life. And, I describe myself as being a giant truck stuck in a ditch with the wheels spinning and the, headers smoking and the pipes, flames coming out of the pipe and roaring noise and going nowhere, and then I learned to be still, that I don't have to fix everything. That if I don't, if I don't, I don't have to reach outside of myself to fix things that are, going wrong inside of me, that are, the parts of me that are, not feeling good right now. I don't have to go out and fix that. I can just be still, and that it will pass like a storm cloud, like lying on a hill and watching dark cloud come and a white cloud or whatever. And that if I can sit still with that stuff, that God does the hard work and be peaceful, be filled with just with peace
and a
and
faith
assurance
that it's going to be handled. It's not my job.
And it makes me a lot more efficient and effective as a human being, being able to be still. And, there's a story about Abraham Lincoln, who was asked about how he would cut down. He was the rail splitter, so he was, handy with an axe. And he was asked about what he would do if he had 5 hours to cut down a giant oak tree. And he said he'd spend 4 hours sharpening the axe. And to me, that's a metaphor for, being in a good spiritual condition. If I'm in a good spiritual state, I am much more effective as a human being. It not only takes that knot out of my stomach of anxiety that I was born with and that empty hole inside of myself that I was trying to fill with drugs and sex and risky extreme behavior and all that. It makes me peaceful inside, but also it somehow alters the universe so that my luck changes. The lights turn green, the parking place is open, and people call when they're supposed to. There's I see all these little synchronicities happening around me, these little coincidences and weird little miracles that feel like God reaching in and touching me and saying, I got you. So it makes me
such a magic trick. It's such a magic trick. Let's just start with the fact it just means you're not God. Let's just start that you're not. And you just see them go, oh, thank God. Like I don't have to be in control of everything. I can just be in the passenger seat and like let the good things come. And the things that don't come aren't for you. It's like the rejection's God's protection.
And that's the trick, is that, the trick that God has is taking chaos and, and bringing order out of it. And each one of us is little, our magical ability is to do that in life, to try to, whatever we encounter, whatever bad thing we encounter, to try to make something good out of it, to process in the way that, you can be of use to other people, that you can, that you know how to console people, that you know what to say, that you can have, that you gain wisdom from it. The word wisdom means the knowledge of God's will. And it means that you have an instinctive knowledge about what is right and what's wrong, and how to turn, bad things into something good for somebody else. I want to thank all of you here, and I'm glad to see so many young people here. We've had 3 polls come out in the last 3 weeks that have been really fantastic for this campaign. The Quinnipiac poll, which came out about 2.5 weeks ago, showed me at 22%. And then the Harvard-Harris poll, which is Mark Penn's outfit, the gold standard poll, showed 22% also nationwide, and showed me at young people under 36 years of age that I'm 10 points ahead of President Trump and President Biden, which is extraordinary. And then the New York Times Siena poll, which is a very, very powerful poll. A lot of the national polls are about 700 to 1,000 people. The Harvard poll, the New York Times poll, I think was 3,600. There are over 3,000 people, so it was a really a very, very strong sampling, and that showed that in the 8 battleground states that show me an average of 24% with 20, and remember, all I have to do is to get to about 37%, because you just need a plurality, and it's winner take all with the electoral votes. So I need to get to 270 electoral votes. I don't even need to win majorities. I just need to get up to about 37%. And that will put me ahead of the other 2 contenders. And if I can do that in certain enough states, I can, I will win. And we have 12 months to do that. So I'm in better shape than any independent for 100 years, since Teddy Roosevelt. And it's because of young people. In that last poll, I not only take 18 to 34, but everybody under 45 years old, I win against both Trump and Biden. So I'm climbing up. I have momentum. I have 30, I think 36% of the independent vote. The 2 key metrics are young people and independents, and I win both of those. I am in very, very good shape to win this election. And people have asked me, why do you think you're doing so well with young people? And the reason for that to me is obvious, and I'm the only one who's talking about what's happening to young people in this country. And my father used to say that the future, the promise of a nation, the present promise of a nation, can be measured by the current prospects of its young people.
Hello and happy Thanksgiving from everyone here at Rising. Brianna and I will be back to bring you the latest news next week. In the meantime, enjoy this flashback from earlier this year. 2024 Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. testified on Capitol Hill today in the House Judiciary Select Subcommittee for the Weaponization of the Federal Government hearing. Democratic lawmakers on the committee blasted Kennedy as he testified about censorship, tech companies, and free speech. In fact, here's some of Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz actually trying to stop Kennedy's testimony as this whole thing was ongoing. Let's watch some of that.
11, Clause 2, which Mr. Kennedy is violative of, I move that we remove into executive session because Mr. Kennedy has repeatedly made despicable anti-Semitic and anti-Asian comments as recently as last week. Rule 11, Clause 2 says, whenever it is asserted by a member of the committee that the evidence or testimony at a hearing may tend to defame, degrade, or incriminate any person, or it is asserted by a witness that the evidence or testimony that the witness would give at a hearing may tend to defame, degrade, or incriminate the witness, and it goes on. Mr. Kennedy, among many other things, has said, I know a lot now about bioweapons. We put out hundreds of millions of dollars into ethnically targeted microbes. The Chinese have done the same thing. In fact, COVID-19, there is an argument that it is ethnically targeted. COVID-19 attacks certain races disproportionately. The races that are most immune to COVID-19 are...
Is the lady making a motion or a speech?
I've made a motion to move into executive session because Mr. Kennedy's testimony...
Mr. Chairman, I
and
move
his
to table the
previous
motion.
statements.
Meanwhile, Republican Chairman Jim Jordan tweeted in response, Democrats are attempting to censor speech during a censorship hearing. Can't make it up.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. joins Brianna and I here in the studio right now to discuss. Mr. Kennedy, welcome to our program.
Thanks for having me back.
So you testified today about social media censorship, some of it done at the federal government's behest. And as that was happening, right at the start, members of the federal government actually tried to prevent you from speaking. What did you make of that paradigm happening, unfolding in real time on the very issue you were there to talk about?
You know, I was censored. You know, Judge Doty's decision was released 2 weeks ago. It was an extraordinary 155-page decision by a federal district judge enjoining the federal government from censoring anymore, from colluding with social media. In fact, Judge Doty asked the White House to have no more contact with any of the social media sites because of the magnitude of the censorship. I was in Judge Doty's decision. He mentions that I was the first one that President Biden tried to censor 2 days after he was sworn in White House officials contacted Facebook and asked them to take down my site, which they did, take down my platform, which they did. They took down my entire Instagram site with 900,000 people, and I had no misinformation on there. They had to make up a new term called malinformation, and that means information that is true but nonetheless offensive to federal policies. So for a long time, I was being censored both by the Trump administration and by the Biden administration. Once I declared for president, it became more difficult. So now they've started this slander offensive against me to silence me. This was extraordinary because it was a hearing on censorship. And number one, 102 Democrats signed a letter asking that I not be allowed to talk. And when I got there, the Democrats, each of them, listed all these slanders, all of which are untrue. I've never made an anti-Semitic comment in my life, and I said that under oath, or a racist comment not once in my life. I have a better position on Israel than anybody on that committee and anybody in that chamber. I'm the only one who's asked that President Biden revoke the $2 billion that he's sending to Iran. Oh, but they listed all these libels, and then they would not allow me to reply. So they literally made every effort possible to make sure that I couldn't talk. And, the issues that I'm talking about are issues that are of great concern to American people, not only the First Amendment, but the economic issues, the destruction of the middle class. But we need to be able to talk about those things. And this is what I said to the committee. We're a democracy. The free flow of information is the sunlight, it's the water, it's the fertilizer for democracy. We're riven now by this kind of polarization of name calling and hatred and vitriol and marginalization, and we somehow need to start talking to each other again in a way that's gentle, that's kind, that's dignified, respectful, and understanding.
Yeah, I want to ask you a little bit about that because I think it was anticipated that the Democrats were going to have the response to you that they had going into this hearing. There were a number of statements that were made over the course of the last week or so that seemed to foreground the idea that they were going to focus on your statements that they characterized as anti-Semitic and avoid the substance of the censorship issues that you were there to talk about. And I wonder what you make of the situation that you're in, where you're running in the Democratic Party. And ostensibly moments like this, hearings like this, are opportunities to bring the priorities that you care about, like censorship, to the public, where they've been siloed for recent history over in a lot of alternative and right-leaning sites. If Democratic electeds are going to have this kind of response to you in a hearing like this, have you thought about strategically how you plan to help Democratic voters prioritize issues like censorship and like some of the other environmental concerns, some of the COVID mandate vaccine concerns that you've raised and which have been very popular in alternative media?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I clearly have the DNC against me. And, it's not a coincidence that Debbie Wasserman Schultz was leading the kind of battle against me. And she's the same individual who was charged with corruption for getting Bernie, who was leading and almost certainly would have won.
Right.
And she led the DNC's efforts to exclude him from the race. So I was not surprised about her attitude toward me. I'm hoping, Bernie found an audience, despite the fact that the entire power structure was against him. And I think I have even an advantage on what Bernie Sanders had, because that was before there were podcasts, and that was, he didn't really have the ability to talk to large amounts of grassroots rank-and-file Democrats. And I'm hoping that that will give me a path into the voters in the primary, despite the fact that the DNC is trying to shut me down.
I want to give you a chance to answer the criticism you got from those comments you made a week ago at the dinner, where you said there's an argument that COVID was engineered as a weapon to ethnically target different races, and you referenced a study that showed this one study that showed that one of the receptors for COVID not being present in the disease for Ashkenazi Jews. and then were criticized that that was an anti-Semitic finding. And I've heard some people in the scientific community say, well, that even if that is true of the science, that the COVID doesn't have that receptor, it doesn't necessarily mean that category of Jewish people would be less affected. And also, we don't have evidence that it's a theory that it was engineered as a bioweapon. I mean, we're still arguing about whether I think there's a lot of evidence it could have come from a lab, but we still haven't even settled that question, let alone whether it was engineered on purpose. So how do you respond to those criticisms?
I mean, my statement, you made a pretty good synopsis of my statement. I did not say that it was that COVID was. I certainly didn't say it was engineered to target certain races. What I did say is that the United States, China, and Russia are putting large amounts of money into ethnic bioweapons. And then I pointed to an NIH-funded paper, actually a series of papers between 2019 and 2021, that showed that receptor sites on the, as you say, the docking site on the furin cleave is compatible with the ACE2 receptors in the lungs of certain races, African, people of African descent, most of all Caucasians, and then there's a series of people, ethnic Chinese, one of the least, and a number of other races, including Amish. And with the most incompatible being, in other words, the most protected being Finns, people from Finland. Now, I never suggested that in the real world that the infection infected those people more or less. And I never suggested that it was engineered deliberately by anybody to achieve that effect. There are many, many viruses that have disproportionate effect on races. What the significance to me was, as a kind of proof of concept, that this is something that bioweapons engineers would pursue. And that's all. I certainly did not mean that it was never intended, never entered my mind that it was engineered deliberately to protect Jews and injure other people.
Yeah, there's something about one of the statements that Stacey Plaskett, a representative from the Virgin Islands, made at the hearing today, where she was speaking critically of the idea of talking about COVID disproportionately affecting Black people in particular, when many of us remember earlier in the pandemic, a lot of sensitive conversations around the fact that instances like the Tuskegee experiment and other bad interactions between the Black community in the United States and the medical institutions that we have created, I think, legitimate skepticism among Black people who were considering whether or not to get vaccinated. So at an earlier time in the pandemic, it seemed like the progressive, dare I say, woke thing to talk about, which is how to encourage Black people, despite this legitimate concern they have, to go ahead and get vaccinated. And at today's hearing, it seemed like that was flipped on its head somewhat, whereas talking about the fact of there being any disproportionate consequences or outcomes in various populations was evidence of a kind of racism. I mean, what do you make of how your statements have been characterized, arguably mischaracterized in this context by Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, my statements have been consistently, as I said, I mean, I've never made an anti-Semitic statement in my life, but I do talk about the science. The studies that I mentioned just now were funded by NIH. They were done by scientists at the Cleveland Clinic. They were published, one of them was published in a really high-impact, high-gravitas journal. I think it's UBC Medical, which is the top 10 journals in the country. So I was just talking about the science. I wasn't trying to put interpretations on it. The interesting thing is that Blacks did die disproportionately during COVID. But I doubt if it was because of the virulence of anything to do with the virus. I think it was more the disparities in medical care in Black neighborhoods, and also the levels of chronic disease in American Blacks. For example, Blacks were dying in our country at a rate of 3,000 people per million population. In Haiti, which is a poor country, we were told the poor countries were going to be devastated. They had a 1%, about 1.3% vaccination rate, so almost nobody was vaccinated. And they were dying at a rate of 14 people per million population, so 1/200th of our death rate. The same in Nigeria. The average in Africa was about 320 per million population. That's 1/10 of what we had here. So it's unclear. These are all things that need to be studied. But I never believed that it was because I think it's unlikely that it's because the virus is more virulent towards Africans.
Could those discrepancies, those differences in the lethality of COVID be attributed to different
yes.
ages of the population? Yes. I don't know exactly, but the
yes.
average age in Haiti is probably younger than here and things like that.
Yes, there are many other covariables. And it's interesting. I mean, these are things that should be studied. So I don't think you can make any conclusion from them. But for example, Japan, which has the oldest population in the world, had a death rate about 1/10 the United States. So, these are things. NIH is a $42 billion annual budget. We ought to be looking at that and saying, why are some people surviving? Is it because they took ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine in this country? What are the protocols? What are the other differences, so that the next time we have a disease like this, that we actually have some knowledge about it. But those kind of the real questions that you'd want answered are not studied, and that is frustrating.
Do you think there's, they talk about hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. I've looked at a lot of the studies. It seems pretty mixed to me. I haven't seen a lot of compelling evidence that they did a lot of good. I've seen one argument that ivermectin, which can help you if you have a parasitic infection. Well, if you study the countries where that's more prevalent, where they did a lot of the ivermectin studies, there was a good outcome, but it wasn't because it was fighting. It was making it easier for you to recover from COVID if you also had a parasitic infection at the same time. So I wonder if there's a skew on the slight positive that have you heard this argument before? It wouldn't help you in the U.S. because there's not widespread parasitic infections.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked very, very carefully at the studies. There's now, in fact, I just did an article this week. There are now 100 studies that show that ivermectin had profound benefits, generally speaking, a 70 to 85% reduction in hospitalizations and deaths. It was really a miracle drug, particularly in the later pandemic.
But I'm saying if that was all in like Bangladesh or South America, it could be because
it was all over the world.
Off parasites.
It was all over the world. The countries where they use it for parasites, Nigeria, which has the highest river blindness burden in the world, did have the lowest COVID death rate in the world. They use both. They also have the biggest malaria burden, so virtually the entire population is on hydroxychloroquine, and a large part of the population is on ivermectin for river blindness. So, and they had almost no vaccination. They had, I think, something like 1.3% vaccination. So they did very well. But there are states in India, sort of side-by-side states, like Kerala and Uttar Pradesh, where Kerala used our protocol and had the same comparable death rates, and Uttar Pradesh used ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and ended the pandemic overnight. But there's also, if you go in the literature, and there's a doctor called Meryl Nass who has assembled a lot of these, so that you can go on her website and see them, or Harvey Risch, who's the Yale epidemiologist, has also assembled them. There's 400 studies that show benefits from hydroxychloroquine, over almost 100 studies, I think 99, that show extreme benefits, like devastating benefits of ivermectin. And there's a handful of studies that are government-produced, WHO-produced, financed by Bill Gates, that say that there was no benefit, but those studies have a lot of problems.
Well, Mr. Kennedy, I want to change gears a little bit and go back to something you said earlier, I think, in response to our first question, which is that you bristled at the accusations of anti-Semitism in part because you have the best record on Israel, or the best position on Israel as compared to other people in the field or other people in the room or what have you. And I wanted to raise this concern, I think, that a lot of folks on the left who are interested in your campaign have, which is that what is considered broadly in American discourse and among the Democratic Party, frankly, among the two-party establishment, to be a good position on Israel is not the position that many people on the left take. So there was some frustration with respect to you walking back your support of Roger Waters, the kind of repeated choice to go to Rabbi Shmuley and more conservative members of the community when you are being criticized with these accusations of anti-Semitism. You've spoken about your, quote, unconditional support of Israel. And at a time when progressives were just kind of tacitly sanctioned in the House for saying, in agreement with the international community, that Israel is an apartheid state. When the Democratic, House caucus is passing a resolution saying categorically it is not an apartheid state, against what Amnesty International and all these other groups have said, that it's not a racist state, is that a kind of censorship as well that you're concerned about? Shouldn't Democrats, elected House members, have the ability to criticize any nation state without it seeming like it's a violation that it needs to be responded to with this kind of a resolution, this kind of codified censorship?
Yeah, I mean, I think people ought to be able to criticize Israel, and I don't think it's anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. Here's the distinction. If you're criticizing Israel and not applying the same standards to neighboring states or other states, in other words, if you're making a special category to criticize Israel that's unique to Israel and letting all the other states do the worse, much worse, that then evinces a bias. And let me tell you why I think the moral case for Israel, and that which would take me hours to lay out. But Israel, if you want freedom, if you're, for example, a woman, you'd rather live in Israel than any of the neighboring countries. If you're gay, 2 weeks ago there was a gay pride parade in Israel, 150,000 people. At the same time, Iran was hanging gays from cherry pickers in the major cities. If you're a woman, if you want freedom of religion, you've got to be in Israel. There are Palestinians on the Israeli Supreme Court. Can you imagine there being a Jew on the Supreme Court of any other country in the Middle East? So what I'm saying is, the conflicts between the historical conflicts between the Palestinian and Israel are, if you look at the history of that, it has nothing to do with what happened in South Africa. This is a historical conflict that Israel's repeatedly made huge concessions to try to settle. The Palestinian leadership, I think, has let down the Palestinians time and time again. I refuse. The Palestinian Authority pays Palestinians to kill Jews at this point.
So there's a lot that is disputed in there. But let me just start by saying Human Rights Watch, for instance, qualifies Israel as an apartheid state for the following reasons. It points to sweeping restrictions on the movement of Arabs, Palestinians in the region, widespread land confiscation, the imposition of harsh conditions which have led to thousands of Palestinians leaving their homes under conditions that amount to forcible transfer, the denial of residency rights to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and their relatives, and the suppression of basic civil rights to millions of Palestinians. So I think that many people bristle at this characterization that, well, there's a double standard that people are applying to neighboring Arab nations and Israel. I think most of us would be happy and are happy to point to any number of human rights violations that happen in other countries around the world, including in the Middle East. The question is whether or not, because of our quote-unquote special relationship with Israel, the amount of money that we give to Israel, the amount of arms that we fund with respect to the Israeli defense, I think as part in our own military interest, not because of particular interest subjectively in the well-being of Jewish people living in the region, that we have an obligation to be more critical of a state that we have so much financial entanglement with. So what do you say to that? That in fact the double standard is people who are willing to criticize those other Arab states while ignoring what our own money is funding in Israel.
Yeah, and I think that we can criticize our friends. Israel is the only democracy in the Mideast, and all of those issues, the difficult relationship between the Palestinians and the Israelis, I believe time and time again the Israelis have, in good faith, various Israeli governments going back to Ehud Barak have tried time and time again to settle in the most generous possible terms possible. If you're dealing with leadership that adopts a charter that we're not just going to go after military targets, we are encouraging our people to kill as many Jewish civilians as possible, which is the policy of the PA, the policy of Hamas. You look at any country that has security issues, and there's going to be some kind of oppression. During World War II, we're a big country. We put all the Japanese residents, citizens, in concentration camps in our country.
Right.
And Israel's a tiny country surrounded by hostile countries, each one sworn to the genocidal destruction of every Jew in Israel. So there is a security issue there, and those kind of security problems require a kind of care and security precautions that anybody else in the world would be a million times more.
So does that justify then something like these illegal settlements that have been roundly criticized by the international community, or maintaining Palestinians in what have been described as open-air prison type states with unequal access to water and basic life-sustaining provisions? Do you condemn those settlements?
Again, Israelis again and again during the negotiations have offered to close those settlements and to obliterate them and to move their populations out. So
out into where? Because I think the fundamental issue is that, as a matter of Israeli policy, and this is part of why.
If you let me finish. In fact, in polling, the residents of those settlements have favored closing the settlements in exchange for real peace agreement. So what the Israelis have said, we will close those settlements. We will, we will trade land for peace. The Israelis have said that again and again and again. In every instance, the Palestinians have refused.
So I think this is the fundamental issue, is that there's some substantive disputes over the timeline of who said no to which kind of agreements and who's at fault for the viability of the two-state solution being increasingly not viable, especially because of the increased expansion of the settlements and the fact that there isn't enough land left, basically, for them to really be an integrated Palestine at this point, which is why the left has moved from a position of a two-state solution to something that needs to be closer to a one-state solution. But the problem with the latter, and this is why Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, et cetera, have described this as an apartheid state, is that the stated position of the Israeli government is that if we were to fully allow Arab Palestinians to have full citizenship and voting rights because of the population's reality of the states, they feel like they can no longer maintain a Jewish state. And a stated desire to do exactly that is definitionally, if you want to enforce laws that keep people at various statuses of citizenship within a country, that's how we get to the position where it's an apartheid state. So then how do you square a condemnation of some of those actions on the part of the Israeli government, which we send so much money to, with what you've said before, which is that you have this, quote, unconditional support? How can you, and when we have this monetary relationship with Israel, also support unconditional support while having the ability to criticize the actions of a government?
Well, by unconditional support, I don't mean that I'm going to co-sign every action by Netanyahu or Likud or whatever, or the settlements, or a particular settlement or a particular policy. I don't mean that. I mean that we have a special relationship with Israel. Israel is an outpost of democracy. And one of the ways to think about this is that after World War II, we developed the same special relationship with Turkey and with Greece because we believe that keeping those countries functional in that part of the world was an important barrier against the expansion of adversaries. Today, we have the Chinese and Russians moving into the Mideast in force. The one ally that we have that is really reliable is Israel. But not only that, Israel is an oasis of democracy. It's the only democracy in the Mideast. It's the only, and listen, even if you're a Palestinian, it's going to be better to be in Israel. If you want to criticize your government, you better do it in Israel than any of the surrounding governments.
Before we let you go, I want to turn one more time to the hearing you participated in today. You spoke, it seemed off the cuff for your actual opening remarks, like you had something prepared, but then you addressed it when Representative Wasserman and Schultz talked.
Yeah.
Sure. You spoke about Americans being at a time of such bitter division. I mean, the hearing was evidence of that division. So much strife and disagreement, including on COVID matters, vaccines, mandates, everything. What is your pitch to a public that is wildly divided on even just the subject of vaccines? Whether they're a good idea, whether they should be required, for who, for what age range, what kind of effect they had on the pandemic. What is your pitch for some kind of vision where people can make their own choices about it and let other people make different choices and have that be okay and us all live together in the same country?
Yeah, I mean, on that issue particularly, I'm character. Part of the way of silencing me is by telling everybody that I'm anti-vaccine. I'm not anti-vaccine. I was fully vaccinated, not with COVID, but I was compliant with all my childhood vaccines.
They tried to use that as a gotcha question today. They were
yeah.
like, "You're vaccinated."
Yeah,
your kids are
people don't know, and you're
like,
it back like I heard it and admit it before.
My kids were all fully vaccinated. My wife got 3 vaccines during COVID. Half my kids got vaccinated by COVID, and the other ones didn't. But and we get along as a family. My job is not to tell people whether to take a vaccine or not. That's up to the individual. My job is to make sure that we have the best science possible. And the problem with vaccines, in my view, the reason I've been a critic is because vaccines are the only medical product that do not have to undergo placebo-controlled testing prior to license by FDA, the only medical product or medical device. We have 72 vaccines that are now mandated for our children. And in many states, they're federally recommended, which means mandated in many states. And none of them have gone through a pre-licensing safety test with a placebo. And because of that, we do not know the risk profile of those products. And nobody can make a rational, common sense, prudent decision about the risk and benefits. So, and that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying, I don't want to ban vaccines. I don't want to tell people you can't get it, you can. I think we ought to have choice, number one, and we ought to have the best science possible.
I've been intrigued by some of the kind of structural critiques you've made. For example, the existence of this National Vaccine Compensation Fund and the fact that there's this limited liability for these manufacturers. And that does seem to tacitly acknowledge that if they were able to be sued for all of the vaccine injuries, that potentially the pharmaceutical manufacturers wouldn't see it as financially viable to continue to manufacture vaccines despite them having these public health issues or benefits. So I wonder, you're saying, and you've been very clear that you're not anti-vaccine and that you have taken advantage of vaccine and your kids and family members have taken the vaccines because of their protective value. But as you critique things like the limited liability of pharmaceutical companies and the choice to set up the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Trust, are you concerned that as president, if that trust fund, if that structure were to change, if we were to get rid of that and open up liability for pharmaceutical companies, that the consequence might be that we don't have access to life-saving, world-changing vaccines anymore?
I don't think so. I think that there are other ways to do that, but to make sure that the vaccines are safe. I think that's what we have to do. I think we need really good safety testing to make sure that they're safe. And, it may be that there's some vaccines that, people would say, I don't want that one. I don't want a rotavirus vaccine. I don't want a hepatitis B vaccine. 4 hepatitis B vaccines. You get hepatitis B is spread through unprotected sexual activity and hypodermic needles. So, maybe I will wait till my child's older to get that vaccine like they do in other countries, and people ought to have those choices. That's all.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., thank you so much for joining us in studio today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
More Rising right after this.
I got to come out and visit him a lot. I love this state. It's got the best skiing in the world, the best snow in the world. We all know that. And I don't just say that when I'm in Utah. I say that when I'm in Colorado and everywhere else. And Governor Walker just told me that we're going to get the Olympics here in 2034. I'm very happy about that, too. And I will be here for that, God willing. I'm very, very proud of Amaryllis, who is not only the campaign manager, but my daughter-in-law, and has had an incredible career serving our country and has devoted herself and her life's energy to ending the warfare state and the war machine. And I'm very, very proud of her. I was in San Francisco last month, and I was in, I spent almost a year, I spent the better part of a year in San Francisco in 2019, or 2019, trying the Monsanto cases. So we had about 2,200 cases of mainly of home gardeners who had gotten non-Hodgkin's lymphoma from using Roundup. And the way the multi-district litigation works, there was a lot of other firms, about 4 other firms that also had their own cases. You consolidate all those cases and then you try them one at a time, usually in front of the same judge, although we switched judges, but we were trying them one at a time. We tried the first 3, the first one. Hello? By the way, if you can't hear me, because if I let me move back. If I drop this microphone so that you can't hear me, please raise your hand and it'll remind me to put it closer to my mouth. Can you guys hear me? Anyway, the first case we won $289 million from the jury. The second case we won $89 million, and the last case we asked for $1 billion from the jury. It was a couple who they and their Labrador Retriever had all, they were spraying in the garden every day, and they take the dog with them. The husband and wife both got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma at the exact same time, and the dog got it the same time the dog died. We asked the jury for $1 billion, and they came back with $2.2 billion. And that's when Monsanto came to the table, and we ended up negotiating settlements for all the cases. Monsanto took glyphosate out of Roundup for home gardening. It's still on our food crops, and still farm workers are still being exposed. But home gardeners are not. But I spent a large part of that year in San Francisco, and every morning, okay, I'm being told to stand back here because the sound is better. Every morning, I would go to the gym in Union Square. Union Square in San Francisco is like Fifth Avenue in New York. It's where all the big shops, all the big American stores, Nordstrom's and Macy's and Bloomingdale's and Gap and Old Navy and Levi are there, and then all the big foreign brands like Gucci and De La Valle and Prada and Burberry and Ferragamo all have big flagship stores there. People come from all over the world to shop in Union Square. And I would go there every morning before court to go to the gym. And I went back there last month, and all of those stores are closed. It's just acre after acre of plywood. And they're closed because of the chaos on the streets in San Francisco now, because there's huge homeless population. And people are scared to go. People are worried about their safety. There's hygiene problems. There's all kinds of, it's not a pleasant place to go anymore. To me, it was heartbreaking. San Francisco is my favorite city. It's the most beautiful city in this country. And it's had its economic heart ripped out of it. And it made me curious about homelessness, which is an issue that I really didn't know much about, other than what we all kind of know about it. So I began researching the cause of homelessness. My son Connor introduced me to this writer called Matthew Desmond, who's written the seminal work on homelessness, which is called Evicted. But he's also done a lot of studies with the University of San Francisco, and they've actually gone out and interviewed thousands of homeless and given questionnaires to thousands of homeless people in San Francisco. My assumption was that homelessness was associated with drug addiction, that it was associated with mental illness and with high levels of poverty, but also that a lot of people in San Francisco who are homeless are imports. They're people who became homeless elsewhere, like New York or Detroit, and decided to spend their last couple of bucks going to San Francisco because it has a famously welcoming social service, very generous social service system. And also the weather is better than sleeping on the grates in the snow. That was my assumption. Also, people in San Francisco told me that in cities like Dallas and Austin, the police, when they arrested a homeless person, instead of putting them in the county jail, would get them a one-way ticket on the Greyhound to San Francisco. And I don't know if it's true or not. That's what a lot of people in San Francisco told me. So when I read Desmond's book and started looking at his videos and his podcasts, it opened my eyes to a couple of things. One is what he shows is that homeless is a lot of, there's a lot of drug addiction among the homeless, but it's a very, very small percentage of the cause. There's much higher drug addiction rates in Detroit and West Virginia, and yet there is not a major homelessness problem in those states. California said we have 525,000 homeless in this country, and half of them are in California, so which only has 12% of the population. So what Desmond says is it's also, while a lot of homeless people become mentally ill, they don't start out that way. You become mentally ill when you spend, even after 3 days on the sidewalk, your psyche begins to deteriorate, and people become mentally ill when they're homeless. And also there's levels of extreme poverty in other places like Detroit and New York, and they don't have the problem. What he shows, the one correlation, and also what he found is the people who are homeless in San Francisco, almost all of them are from San Francisco. They didn't move there. And what he says is the single biggest correlate is housing prices. San Francisco has the highest housing price in the country. And California has the highest. Where I live in California, there's 7,000 homeless in LA, and the average price of a home is $800,000. So you need to make $250,000 to be able to live there, to be able to own a home. And what Desmond says is this epidemic of homelessness that is in California now is building like a tsunami, and it's going to sweep across this country, because the price of housing is going up so dramatically in this country. And 2 years ago, the price of an average home was $215,000. Today, it's $400,000. And the interest rates have gone from 3%, now they're approaching 8%, which means you're going to pay 10% or more. And, for my kids, I have 7 kids. My oldest son is in a home, who's Amarillo's his husband. The younger ones, who are all between 20 and 30, all have good jobs. They all went to the best schools, and none of their friends are considering buying a home because it's just out of reach for them. They're thinking of how to pay their student loans. So you have a whole generation of kids in this country for whom the American dream, for my generation, the central proposition of the fundamental proposition of the American dream was that if you worked hard, if you played by the rules, that you would be able to finance a home. You'd be able to take a summer vacation. You could raise a family. You could pay for your retirement on one job. There's nobody in that generation who believes that that promise is going to be kept to them. In about a month ago, in 2013, there was a poll taken of young people under 35. Amarillo said that, my poll numbers show me 10 points ahead in that generation, under 35. But I'm also winning under 45. I'm beating in a 3-way race against Trump and Biden, I'm winning that generation. And it's because I care about these issues. I see what's happening. I have all these kids in that age cohort. And in 2013, there was a poll taken of American kids under 35 years old. And 85% of them said they were proud of the United States of America. The same poll taken last month showed that only 18% said they were proud of our country. So somehow during the terms of the last 2 presidents of the United States, this entire generation of Americans lost faith in our country And most of them have lost hope for their own lives. They're the first generation in history that believes that their lives are going to be worse, that they're going to be worse off than their parents. And we have betrayed this generation. Our generation has betrayed this generation. We've told them, go to college, everything's going to be okay. Now they're sitting on these piles of debt with no way to pay it. And housing is completely out of reach for them. And, you know, we had a housing boom, and I grew up at a time that economists call the Great Prosperity. It was a 50-year period after World War II, when the American middle class became the greatest economic generator in the history of mankind. When I was 10 years old, my uncle was president. We owned in this country half the wealth on the face of the earth. We were the biggest exporter of goods in the world. Everybody wanted what we have. They wanted our blue jeans, they wanted our transistor radios, RCA Victrolas, American automobiles, everybody, and they wanted our moral authority. They wanted our leadership. And a lot of that was kicked off because we put an entire generation in homes immediately after World War II with the GI Bill and this other legislation that got an entire generation into homes. If you own a home, you care about your community. You care about your police. You go to the PTA meetings, the schools, the transportation. You care about the appearance of your home. You care about your neighbors. But more importantly, you have an entree to the capitalist system because you can borrow money. So if you have an entrepreneurial impulse, you can pursue it because you can take a second mortgage on your house and you can buy, you can invest in a restaurant or a bowling alley or a garage or a retail outlet. And that's what happened after World War II. You had a whole generation who were in houses and they made bets, and the American middle class became this extraordinary economic generator. Well, today we're going from a ownership society to a rental society. And that means that we're going from being citizens to being subjects. And why are housing prices so high? One of the reasons, of course, is inflation, which affects everything, because we spend $8 trillion on wars. We spent another about $8 trillion on COVID, so $16 trillion for which we got nothing in return. And that's being paid for by the American middle class. And that's one issue, and that's affecting the price of everything, because they printed the money without asking permission, without levying taxes, because they didn't have the courage to come and say, we're going to raise your taxes to pay for this and that war. And the way they pay for it is through a hidden tax, a stealth tax called inflation, which lands on the middle class, people in fixed incomes. So everything is going up, but housing is going up more than anything. And why is that? Well, one of the reasons is there are three giant corporations, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And those corporations own 89% of the S&P 500. So they own business in this country. And now they've decided that they want to own the residential housing, and particularly the single-family homes. BlackRock does not buy single-family homes, but it owns Blackstone. BlackRock and Vanguard own Blackstone. By the way, they all own each other, and Blackstone is buying the single-family home. So it's the instrument through which BlackRock is the biggest corporation on earth, has $10 trillion under management. It's 3 times the state of California, the economy. It's the 3rd largest economy in the world. And they own, as I said, the business in this country, and now they're looking to buy the land, the agricultural land, and the residential housing. And corporations already own 6% of the housing in this country, and they're on a trajectory to own between 40 and 60% within 6 years. So all of you have this experience, or know people who've had this experience. They're about to go into escrow or sign a contract on a home, and at the last minute, somebody comes in with a cash offer 20% greater than the asking price and sweeps it off the table. And you have... and you ask, who is this who just took my home? And you look into it, and it's an LLC with an ambiguous name. And then you follow the breadcrumbs, and it traces back to Blackstone, State Street, and Vanguard. So, you know, I'm running against two presidents who are both running on a platform that they brought tremendous prosperity to this country. But I spend a lot of time sitting at kitchen tables with people and with regular Americans. I represent them in lawsuits. I've been campaigning for 6 months. I'm representing 1,000 families in Columbiana County in East Palestine, Ohio, whose lives were upended by the Norfolk. And I represent families in Ohio, West Virginia, all over this country who have been poisoned by DuPont, by all kinds of, by Monsanto, by other large corporations. So I sit at tables with people, and when you say, are you experiencing prosperity, they feel like they're being gaslighted. Today, the average income in this country is now 20%, is now $5,000 less than the cost of basic human needs of food, transportation, and housing. So how are Americans paying that $5,000 debt? And this isn't even good food. It's not like Whole Foods. It's like, it's what you buy in the grocery store where you have to eat 8 carrots today to get the same nutritional value as a carrot would give you, 15 years ago. And it's filled with atrazine and neonicotinoids and glyphosate and all these other poisons. So if you're living on the bare minimum and eating that kind of food, you still are $5,000 in debt at the end of the year. How are Americans handling that debt? They're putting it on their credit cards. And the credit card company is charging them 22% interest. I had a commercial fisherman, who's a buddy of mine, who sent me a screenshot the other day of a credit card bill. He's paying 37% interest. So if the mafia did that to you, it would be called loan sharking, and they'd go to prison. But if Visa, MasterCard, Wells Fargo, Chase, Citibank, and Morgan charge you that, it's just business as usual. And who do you think owns every one of those corporations? Right, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. So they're doing it right in front of us. They're strip mining the wealth from the American public, and I'm talking to people who are making these ghastly choices today. Elderly people who are cutting their pill prescriptions in half to make it to the end of the week so they can buy food. Young mothers who are downgrading their ingredients in order to make it through the checkout line. A young guy who came up to me in New Hampshire recently who said, every Tuesday I have to make a choice between whether I'm going to have a meal that day or whether I'm going to fill my car up with gasoline. A young couple who talked to me about an argument they had sitting in their living room in a rental apartment they can no longer afford, with a baby crying on their lap and having to wonder whether the baby was $50 sick or $100 sick or $500 or $1,500 sick before they bring them to the emergency room. These are choices Americans shouldn't have to make. You remember during the pandemic, they shut down 3.3 million businesses. A lot of these are small businesses in our communities. A lot of those businesses will never reopen. 41% of Black-owned businesses will never reopen. And many of these had generations of sweat equity and currency in them. But the one company that really did well was Amazon. So Amazon, I'm suing Amazon now and Elizabeth Warren because they censored a book that I wrote that was critical of the lockdowns. And it's not the Fauci book, it was another book that I did with Joe Mercola. And so they got to censor the critics of a policy that was making them rich. They got to shut down all their competitors. And we had 3.3 million competitors they closed down. And all of us got a 2-year lesson in how to use Amazon. So I didn't know how to use Amazon prior to COVID. And, you know, it's a magical experience. You just find a picture of something that you want, and you push send, and it's in your driveway in 24 hours. So yeah, it's very, very seductive, but there's a cost to it. Because that local retailer, you were paying a little more and it was less convenient. But he's gone now, and he was paying local taxes in this community. He was the guy with the plaque on his wall of gratitude from the local Boy Scout troop. He was the guy for me, the local retailers where I lived in Mount Kisco, New York, were paying for my kids' hockey jerseys. They were paying for their Little League uniforms. They were the places where, you know, they would give my boys and girls a summer job when they were kids. And they're gone now. And they were paying the local taxes. Amazon's not paying any taxes locally. But at least they're paying federal taxes, right? No. Last year, they paid 0. So they're doing it right in front of us. They're strip mining the wealth from the American public, from the American middle class. They're strip mining, sending our equity. During COVID, we created a billionaire a day. President Biden and President Trump, 500 days, a billionaire a day, 500 new billionaires. And we shifted $4 trillion north from the American middle class to this new oligarchy of billionaires. And, you know, and we are still have plenty to send away to the war. In March of 2022, we committed $113 billion to the Ukraine war. This is a war that should have never happened. It's a war over us wanting to extend NATO into Ukraine. The Russians tried to settle it twice with extremely beneficial terms to us and Ukraine. And we made Zelensky, we sent, you know, Joe Biden sent Boris Johnson over there and made Zelensky tear up the agreement. The Russians were pulling their troops out already. And the chief negotiator for Ukraine came clean. We already knew this because we knew it from the prime ministers of Turkey and Israel who presided over the negotiations. But this week, the primary negotiator for Ukraine came out and said, yeah, that's true. They made us tear up that agreement. So that was a war that shouldn't have happened. Well, and we committed in March of 2022 $113 billion to Ukraine. And that same month, and by the way, the entire budget, annual budget for EPA is $12 billion a year. So that's all we got for the environment in this country. So we committed more than 10 times that in a single month. And then since there, we committed another $24 billion, and President Biden is asking for $61 billion right now, $200 billion. So that same month, we cut food stamps for 30 million Americans from $283 a month to $23 a month. Try feeding yourself on that. We cut Medicare that month to 15 million Americans. And that same month, the Fed printed $300 billion, twice what we're giving Ukraine, unanticipated to bail out the Silicon Valley Bank. So when the bankers need it, and when the military contractors need it, the door to the safe is wide open. But when Americans are hungry, when they're sick, when they're troubled in their lives, the door is shut to them for regular Americans. And that month, Mitch McConnell was asked on national TV, because Republicans are supposed to care about the budget deficit. Mitch McConnell was asked by a reporter, can we really afford this? We got a $33 trillion deficit now, debt, national debt, and we're passing on to your generation. And he said, well, don't worry, because it's not really a gift to the Ukraine. It's going to U.S. military contractors. Oh, it's going to Raytheon, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and Lockheed. Who do you think owns every one of those companies? Right, BlackRock. And then Tim Scott, during the last Republican debate, not this one, the one before it, they were asked by a reporter, they're all the Republicans with the exception of Vivek, God bless him, who was saying, maybe we don't have unlimited money to spend on
How do you prefer people to refer to you as? Bobby, RFK, Mr. Kennedy?
Yeah, Robert.
Robert? Yeah. Right, nice to meet you, Robert. I mean, we met briefly before in Miami. And for a while, we've wanted to sit down and talk to you because I keep seeing you and meeting you at Bitcoin events, and we run a Bitcoin podcast. But there's a few other things I want to get into first. So why are you going independent?
Well, I wanted to stay in the Democratic Party, but the party was making rules and procedures that made it impossible for me to win. My hand was kind of forced, but now that I'm out, I'm happy about it.
How does that free you up on the campaign trail?
First of all, it lengthens the time of the election because the primaries were essentially effectively open over by March. The Super Tuesday primaries would have been decided. But it also just it allows me to talk to much broader constituencies, to everybody, Republican, Democrat, and instead of just targeting the Democratic primary voters, it allows me to talk to much larger groups of people, much more diverse groups of people, and and it frees me to go to all the states rather than concentrating just in the early primary states. Those are some of the changes.
And does it free you up when you're considering policy?
No, because my policies are my policies, and we don't really poll them. I don't poll what I think is right or popular. I do. I'm trying to do what's right for the country. So I would say that whoever the audience was.
All right, look, I'm obviously a Brit, but I come here a lot. It's about my 100th trip here. I love it over here. I've seen over the last 10 years since I've been coming, gradually the country get more pulled apart. I watched your announcement when you said you're running independent, and you talked about this. So what is it that you can do to unify the country?
There's a number of things. One is just being truthful with people. I think part of the polarization is driven by this this pervasive dishonesty from the institutions that used to be very trustworthy. The United States government was, when I grew up, when my uncle was president, I think 85% of Americans said they trusted the United States government. People could not imagine the government would lie to them. In fact, the first time that people realized that the U.S. government officials lied was in May of 1960. My uncle was running, and there was a U-2, which was a spy plane. Nobody knew about it. It was a secret spy plane. It flew so high nobody could see it. And they didn't think it could be shot down, but the Russians had a mole in Langley, and it allowed them to shoot a missile and shoot one down. The pilot, whose name was Gary Francis Powers, was instructed to kill himself. He had an arsenic shot that he was supposed to give himself, but he didn't do it. But the Russians did not reveal that they had captured him, and they accused the United States. They showed the wreckage, this kind of nondescript piece of machinery and engines. And Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, told Eisenhower to deny the whole thing. And Eisenhower reluctantly did so, and then the Russians produced Gary Francis Powers, and they had to admit that they had lied not only to the Russians, but they had lied to the American people. And that was the first time in American history when Americans went, wow, our government actually lies. They didn't think that, a democracy, you're supposed to do that. And then the Pentagon Papers came out in 71, And then, more and more Americans began realizing, oh, they lie to us all the time. And then, over the next 20 years, they stopped even pretending. So now I think 22% of Americans trust the government. And, those are people who aren't paying attention, because nobody should, because the government lies all the time. But also the big institutions in our country, the media also, now people don't trust them because they also have agendas, which is very, very different than when I was growing up, where there really was, where they tried to stay neutral and tell the truth. One of the issues, my father, ran in a time in '68, a time of similar divisions. At that time, we had our cities burned, over 100 cities burned. When Martin Luther King was killed, we had Black Panthers and the Weatherman movement planting bombs and killing people. We had the U.S. military shooting people on our campuses. Oh, it was similarly polarized, and the government at that time was lying about the Vietnam War. And, my father ran at that time, and he ran with this, this agenda of just telling the truth to people, and it worked. And the day that he died, he won the most rural state in our country, which is North Dakota, and the most urban, California. And he had succeeded in uniting this coalition of blacks and whites, poor blacks, working class whites, and Catholics and Jews and people from all the different walks of life. And he was able to do that. And it was largely by telling the truth. The other thing that I'm doing in this election that I've been doing for the past 6 months, which to me has been extraordinary, is just to try to focus on the values that we have in common rather than the issues that keep us apart. And there's certain very predictable, what we call culture war issues, guns and abortion and, immigration, issues like that. They're all important issues. Or even climate. They're all important issues, but they're issues that are calculated to keep people at each other's throats. And what I do is focus on issues that we all have in common. And I found that that's a much, much larger landscape. And I tell people, you may not agree with me on everything, but I'm going to tell you the truth, and I'm going to listen to you, and I'm not going to disrespect you for disagreeing with me. And, I found out that everybody wants to help our veterans. Everybody wants to make sure that their families are taken care of. Everybody wants America to have the best education system in the country. Everybody wants to end the chronic disease epidemic that is debilitating our children. Everybody wants to end the corrupt merger of state and corporate power that is strip mining the wealth from the American people. Everybody wants to, to wind down and unravel the warfare state and keep America out of wars. Everybody wants to protect the environment. If you talk to them just about climate, you're going to get a fight. But if you say, do you want to cut down the Appalachian Mountains? Right now we're exploding enough ammonia nitrate explosives. It's the equivalent of a Hiroshima bomb once a week to blow the mountains tops off. They've flattened the 500 biggest mountains in Appalachia. And we have flattened an area larger than the state of Delaware. And we've buried 2,200 miles of rivers and streams. These are the landscapes which so much of America, where Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone roam, and NASCAR racing and country music and bluegrass music came out of those landscapes. And so many of our, our military heroes, Sergeant York and others came out of those landscapes. And here we are dismantling it and destroying it, and nobody likes it. When we did the protests in Flint, Michigan, over the toxic water, we had Hell's Angels standing next to urban blacks. And we were at Standing Rock, which we didn't sell to the American public as a climate change. We said it's about protecting a sacred place. the same thing happened. There were Republican businessmen there, American Indians and blacks and everybody, because people can unite about that. If you say it's just about climate change and, you're going to have to make sacrifices because we tell you on this line, because this line on the graph says it's the end of the world at a certain time. Nobody, there's people who will just rebel against that. They don't want to hear it. But if you tell them, we want to protect this sacred place, we want to protect water for black children in Detroit, nobody's going to disagree with you. Everybody feels passionate about it. And so what I've tried to do is to not sit around bad-mouthing President Trump or President Biden, but just talking to people, in a gentle way about the things they care about and ask them, what do you care about? What do you love? What do you love? What do you love about this country? And they all say the same things. So that's what I try to focus on.
You mentioned the media. How has the media treated you since you've gone independent? Has anything changed?
Well, nothing's changed, I would say. You know what? I would say since my poll numbers started rising, I'm getting more I'd say, fair treatment from the mainstream media. And I would say that I went for probably at least half a decade without getting, I don't think I got a single good article or notice, and I'm not complaining. I'm just stating facts. But I had maybe 10,000, news hits during that period. And all of them were what I would characterize as defamatory at some level or another. And again, I'm not complaining. I'm just stating, facts. And I right now, I've been given interviews. My wife was allowed to go on CNN in an unedited interview, and that never has happened. I had one appearance on CNN for about 5 minutes with Michael Smerconish, and I understood he got in trouble for it. And I've never had one on MSNBC. So but more and more we're getting, I'd say, much fairer treatment from the media, but it has to do mainly with the rise in my polling, I think.
I see two Americas. I see the American when I'm here. Like I said, this is about my 100th time here. I've been to pretty much half the states, traveled a lot. I've interviewed people all over the country, and my experience is it's actually a very united country on the ground. When you go to bars, when you go to clubs, when we're out meeting people, Democrats, Republicans, they all generally get on and agree on the same things. And then what we see is the weaponized media weaponizing the division for whatever incentive it is, whether it's to support a political party or their own agenda. Do you feel like America lost something when it lost the fairness doctrine?
Yeah, I think that was a big part of it. The fairness doctrine was, a doctrine that was enshrined in the Communications Act in 1928, when commercial radio first entered the scene, and there was historically the framers of the Constitution understood that if you controlled the media, that it was critical to have a well-educated public. In fact, there was a debate, early on in our constitutional convention between Hamilton and Adams on the one hand, and Madison and Jefferson. Hamilton and Adams wanted to restrict the franchise, in other words, who could vote, to landed property owners. It wasn't because they were snobs or they didn't believe in democracy, but it was because they believed that an uneducated class would be easily seduced by a tyrant or a demagogue to give up the rights that had been, to relinquish the rights that had been, won with such bloodshed and cost during the Revolution. They thought uneducated people are easily fooled and fall into the seduction of demagogues. And Hamilton and Madison, and Jefferson agreed with them. But they said everybody should get the franchise. And by that, they meant white men, okay? But everybody, whether you own land or not. But they agreed with it, but they said the remedy for that is not to deprive people of their right to vote, but rather to forcibly educate them. So the United States became the first country that had mandatory public education. And it wasn't, it was because they believed that in order to maintain our democracy, you needed a well-informed public. And, Jefferson has on his gravestone, founder of the University of Virginia, they founded colleges, all these land colleges. They funded them by giving away land and allowing the colleges to fund themselves. They thought that was critical to our democracy. So in 1928, when commercial radio was invented, they passed a rule. They thought, if one corporation owns all the radio stations, he'll be able to control the public mind. So they made a rule that said you can own 8 at most. And the reason they picked 8 was because William Randolph Hearst, who owned all these newspapers, the biggest media baron, already owned 8. So that was their cutoff. And then they said you can't own radio and newspapers in the same cities, and they made all these. But they also said if you're using the public airwaves, in other words, radio airwaves, which they say belong to the public, the radio station does not own that airwave. It is licensed to use it, but it is a public trust asset. It's part of the commons. They said if you get that license to use it, you have to use it for the public interest. What that means is, you can sell entertainment and make yourself rich, but every day at certain times, you have to tell the news and neutral. You have to tell the truth. That's why if you remember the old AM radios in this country, every 15 minutes there was a news break. That wasn't they wanted to do that. They were forced to do that by the law. And on television, they said the television at a time of day when every American is likely to be home, you have to have a news hour, and you have to tell them what's happening, issues, and you can't tell them, a news about J-Lo and Brad Pitt or Michael Jackson or Taylor Swift. It has to be information that is critical to the public making good judgments about policies. Right? Mm-hmm. So, that was the law in our country. So when I was a kid, you had people like Walter Cronkite on television, who were the most trusted man in America. The news divisions were money losers for every network. But they knew that they had to put money in them to keep their license. They had to be a credible news network, organization, and they made them off limits. They brought in people of impeccable integrity to run them. The bean counters at the network didn't dare even talk to them. They were disdainful of anybody who, was about advertising and money. They were expected to lose money every year, but it was the condition for them owning that license. And in 1980, Ronald Reagan got elected with the help of the Hollywood studios, who wanted to consolidate control over the news division, over the television networks, and the Christian right, which was at that point a lot of these Christian pastors were starting television networks, and the television network. Part of the fairness doctrine is they had to give equal time to people of different points of view. So there was a famous case, the Red Lion case, where people with, I think it was the American Lung Council, sued NBC or one of the networks because they were putting advertisements for Mustang, which was a big gas-guzzling car, on, and they said, now you have to give us equal time because we have asthma, and that's giving us asthma attacks. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, you do. They had to give equal time to their opponents, to different points of view. And when the Christian right, these Christian pastors who ran networks, they did not want to give equal time to, atheists or Satan or whoever, understandably. So they Reagan appointed a FCC commissioner who basically threw out the fairness doctrine. He said, we don't care what you do anymore. There was this immediate consolidation in the press. And the press, the bean counters in each of the networks said to the news divisions, you don't have to do this. You can put entertainment, you can put blood sports on, anything you want. People like Walter Cronkite were replaced by mercenaries like Anderson Cooper and Jake Tapper, who just promote pharmaceutical products for their advertisers and promote the war machine and all of the orthodoxies, and they don't question orthodoxies. And then you had a big consolidation where today virtually every network in this country, almost all the radio stations, all of the newspapers, all of the most of the billboard owners, and all of the big internet content providers are controlled by 5 companies. So there's 5 guys who are deciding what you hear on the news, and ultimately the owners of those networks are BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And of course, what do they want to do? They want to keep us all at each other's throats, because when the king and queen look over the balustrades of the castle and they see all their subjects fighting each other, they go back to the banquet hall and they pop champagne corks because they know nobody's coming over the wall, to take it all back. And and it's a strategy. They keep us fighting each other, and they know, it's like the jangling of the keys over here. Look at this, everybody, while you're robbing the bank over here. And,
Do you think a new fairness doctrine would be good?
I think that would be great, but it's a heavy lift. And also, it's a different media environment today because you have cable news, which is not a public airwave. And so it would be very complex about how would you regulate it. But I do think that the networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, the ones that are actually using the airwaves, that they ought to be, that the fairness doctrine ought to apply to them.
Yeah. So you say there they're jangling the keys while they rob you here. The people who listen to my show, I mean, it is a Bitcoin show, but it's more than that. It's a money show. It's macroeconomics. It's privacy. These are all the things people care about. One of the hot topics right now is inflation, national debt. We travel a lot with this. We've been to Lebanon, Argentina, Venezuela. We've been to all the places that have experienced very high inflation. Your central bank and your government are doing some of the things that those countries have done. And so whilst inflation's come back down, national debt's increasing, you're facing recessionary pressures. Like, how do you deal with this behemoth of debt that's been created?
I mean, you have to cut the debt, which means cutting the military basically in half. We got to cut the military down to $500 billion a year, and then we got to cut our healthcare costs, which is the largest cost, which I'm going to do by ending the chronic disease epidemic. When I was a kid, 6% of medical costs went for chronic disease. Today, 90%, 93% of Medicare is chronic disease. It's $4.3 trillion the total med costs, and almost $4 trillion of that is chronic disease, and we now have this epidemic that, unlike any other country in the world. We had the highest body count during COVID. We had 16% of the world COVID deaths here, and we only have 4.2% of the world's population. And a lot of that was because we have the highest chronic disease burden of any country in the world. CDC said the average person who died from COVID in America had 3.8 chronic diseases. So they had obesity, they had asthma, they had diabetes, and something else. And, and we need to end that to get our medical costs down. We pay more per capita, 2 or 3 or 4 times more than European countries in our country, and we have the worst health outcomes. So I think we're 79th in the world in health outcomes. We're behind Mongolia, Nicaragua, Cuba, Costa Rica, and it's all because of chronic disease. We have smart doctors here. We have great access to medical care. But we have this terrible chronic disease epidemic. We need to get rid of it. And it's debilitating on, the whole generation of kids. Well, when I was a kid, 1 in 10,000 people in my generation, 69-year-old men, had autism. Today, 1 in 34. Those are kids who, are never going to have a job. They're never going to pay taxes. I'm talking about full-blown autism. They're never going to write a poem. They're never going to play baseball. They're never going to, go out on a date. They're not going to serve in our military. And, they become this huge economic drag for their families, their careers, et cetera. And that, the cost of autism alone by 2030, according to a recent study by Weiler and Blaxall, is going to be $1 trillion a year just for that. We need to end that, and we can do it, and we can do it very, very quickly.
You've referred a few times now to when you were a kid. I don't know America from when you were a kid. I only know it from the last 20 years when I've been coming here. I still love the place, but how has the country lost its way so much?
How did it lose its way?
Yeah, on so many issues.
Well, 3 days before my uncle took the oath of office, President Eisenhower gave what today we should look at as the most important speech in American history, where he warned Americans against the emergence of a military-industrial complex that would transform America into an imperium abroad and a national security state at home, and that would bankrupt the American middle class with expenses. And, my uncle spent 1,000 days in office at war with his own military-industrial complex, keeping the country out of war. He didn't send a single combat troop abroad to die during his presidency. And, he ordered all 16,000 advisors home from Vietnam 30 days before he was murdered. And a week after that, President Johnson, the incoming president, remanded that order and sent 250,000 troops over. And Nixon then sent 500,000 over, and 56,000 never came back, and we killed 1 million of them. My cousin was killed there, George Skakel, but my father ran against the war in '68, so 5 years later, he was killed, when he won the Democratic primary. Martin Luther King had become a peace activist earlier that year, and he was killed 2 months before my father. And those traumas, and plus the Vietnam War itself, and 9/11 and COVID, each one of those traumas pushed us down that road about which Eisenhower had warned us, which is turning America into a military-industrial complex, destroying our democracy. And today, we're living in the world that he warned us about, which is our democracy has become like a Hollywood stage set. It's a kabuki theater of democracy where people pretend to go through an electoral process that doesn't really give us any more choice than the Soviet Union's electoral process, where the party would pick the candidates and tell you who to vote for, and there's nobody in this country that I talk to who believes that their voices are audible in Washington, D.C. And and we've seen this corrupt merger of state and corporate power that's led by the military-industrial complex. Now involves the oil industry, the pharmaceutical industry. In fact, when Eisenhower issued that warning, everybody remembers the paragraph in which he described the emergence of the military-industrial complex. But the next paragraph, he says, and part of that is the federal scientific bureaucracy that will make science the slave to industry, the mercantile ambitions of industry, and will pervert science and make it a tool for control. We've seen all that happen, and lastly with COVID, and I think it's the predictable outcome of letting corporations capture the agencies that are supposed to regulate them.
People listening to this would say one of the things that you can do is defund the money printer, and this is why there's such big proponents of Bitcoin, because it's a open, permissionless, transparent form of money, which cannot be debased. I know you've covered it before, but you're now at a Bitcoin event. But like, what does Bitcoin actually mean to you?
Well, I've told this story before that I had I was not really curious about Bitcoin. My kids talked about it all the time. My kids are very entrepreneurial and very curious, and they were, it was cutting edge for them. This is the future. But I didn't pay any attention into the trucker strike in Ottawa when I saw the Canadian government go in and shut down all the truckers' bank accounts. These were people who were never convicted of a crime, never charged with a crime, but the Canadian government used AI, facial recognition, and surveillance technologies to identify the participants in a protest that was peaceful, that was like Woodstock. It was they were exercising a right that we all assume that we have, which is the right to petition, to assemble. And their bank accounts were shut, and they couldn't pay their mortgages. They couldn't pay their the gas, the petroleum for the diesel for their trucks. They couldn't leave. They couldn't buy food for their children. I have a friend who's one of those truckers who was threatened with jail because he couldn't pay the court-ordered alimony. So I recognized at that point that that transactional freedom was important as freedom of expression, because we have freedom of expression, but if the government then can punish you by shutting down your bank accounts without even charging you with a crime, they have the ultimate power to turn us into slaves. And, if they shut down your food supply, they throw you out of your home, they starve your children. If you say something they don't like, that's the end. So, and every power that government takes, it will, the rule is it will ultimately be abused to the maximum extent feasible. And the other rule is that nobody ever complied their way out of totalitarianism. And Bitcoin, to me, I started looking at that and saying, here is transactional freedom is critical. And Bitcoin is the answer to that, because nobody controls it. It's this incredibly elegant solution that gives us transactional freedom, that allows you and freedom all over the world. You can transact it in places. I have a friend in Gaza who I was trying to send money to recently and can't leave, and is starving. And I was trying to send money and couldn't. There's no PayPal. There's no Venmo there. There's no bank accounts. And, the one way you could do it was through digital currency, because you can do it through an app.
So policy-wise, you would defend the right to own Bitcoin?
Oh, yeah. They should own it,
Self-custody wallets?
Self-custody wallets, self-custody nodes, and people, I'm for freedom. So, Bitcoin is for transactional freedom, that's the most elegant solution.
All right, a couple more questions before we finish up. Another issue that's really important to the people who listen to this, that they'd love to know your opinion on. If you were to become president, there's three specific people that people have an interest in presidents' opinions on and whether they would pardon them. It's Julian Assange, who I've interviewed, his brother, father and wife, Edward Snowden, and someone called Ross Ulbricht. I don't know if you know him. Have you expressed your feelings on what you would do with regards to these?
Yeah, I'm going to pardon Assange and Snowden on day one.
Mm-hmm.
I am going to very carefully look at Ross Ulbricht's case.
Okay.
And if I determine that Ross Ulbricht was that his sentence, which seemed to be a very punitive sentence, that sentence was not appropriate for the crime that he committed, but was instead a signal to Bitcoin or to, cryptocurrencies, then I will pardon him as well. And I will make that determination within weeks of getting elected.
Fantastic. Okay, a final question before we go, and I appreciate your time, and I know how busy you are. You've mentioned both your father and your uncle a few times in this interview. I know it's difficult to answer for people, but I would still be interested. What do you think they would make of America today? And if they were running today, what do you think would be the issues they would focus on?
I mean, I think they, I don't like to speak to them because in one way, they belong to the ages now, and they belong to the country. So, but I know, of course, I knew both of them well, and I, studied their lives and their concerns, and I know that public health, the chronic disease epidemic would be really disturbing to them. I think the warfare state would be, would be very, very disturbing to them. And I think the polarization that's happening in this country would disturb them very deeply.
Do you have any thoughts on CBDCs? Is that something you would stop?
Listen, CBDC, I'm wary about central bank digital currencies because of, it seems like the first step in taking people's Bitcoins, taking them away and making it so that, and taking away your sovereignty over your wallet, your node, et cetera. And, it also is, if that's all we got, listen, you can look at another central bank currency that we already have. It's called cash. And cash, when you spend it, is anonymous. Your transactions are private. And the government, doesn't know about it, and that's freedom. You don't want the government to know, when you're buying, let's say do you want the government to know that you bought a beer at 7:00 this morning, right? Or if you bought pornography or if you bought cigarettes or whatever.
Or I made a donation to a political candidate.
Or you made a donation. That's nobody's business, right? It's not the government's business. And there are people in the government who can use that kind of information against you. And, you can see why central bank digital currencies would be attractive to technocrats and to totalitarians, because it gives them perfect knowledge of everything you do. Every transaction you make can be taxed. It can be kept track of. And the banks can make money on the friction from every transaction that you make. Nothing is invisible to them. And that takes away a lot of our freedom. And, ultimately with central bank digital currencies, they can be programmable. So that if your social credit score drops, if you're out during a COVID mandatory mask day and you have your mask hanging below your nose and, a facial recognition system says, hey, he's breaking the rules. He's too close to his girlfriend. He's supposed to be 6 feet. They then deduct points from your social credit score. And when you go below a certain amount, they do what they do in China with programmable currencies, where they make it so that your money won't work anymore. I mean, in China, they don't have credit cards now. They have just, you pay with your face.
Yeah, scary.
Right, scary. So they can say, okay, your face won't work on a cash register except within a grocery store of a certain radius of your house. And they you're a slave at that point. But also, with the advent of all these AI technologies now, and the Internet of Things, consider what they'll be able to do to you. They'll be able to shut off your car, while you're driving it if they want. So they'll be able to shut off your water supply.
You sound more than wary. It feels like you've connected all those dots and you get it.
Yeah, that keeps me up at night.
Well, listen, thank you for your time because I know how busy you are. As I said, is there anything you want to say to the audience before we leave?
I mean, I could talk for 2 hours. I would
have you
say
for 2
one
hours.
thing. I'd say Kennedy24.com.
Yeah.
Go and push the donate button if you can, even if you give $2. But join the Army. We're doing ballot access now, which I have to go in every state and get on the ballot. If you want to volunteer for the campaign, please contact us because we need as many volunteers to sign up, sign ballot access commission petitions in every state. And we got people out there doing it. So if you want to be part of the solution, contact us.
All right. Well, listen, all the best. Thanks for your time. If you ever do have 2 hours, we'll take it. But otherwise, all the best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Kennedy, thank you for the time.
Thank you, Jason.
You're doing well in polls with young voters and independent voters, but we're a year out from the election. How do you maintain that momentum and grow it further?
Well, I have 12 months, so I'm doing better right now. I'm at, according to the latest New York Times poll, there's 3 big polls that kind of confirm me in the same 22 to 24%. The most recent is the New York Times poll, which has me at 24%, which is about the same. The last independent candidate to get that high this early was Teddy Roosevelt, so that's 100 years ago with the Full Moose Party. So I feel like I'm in a good position right now, and I feel also that there's every poll shows my favorabilities are much, much higher than either of the other candidates. And in Americans under 45, I'm the most popular, which is a key bellwether, and with independents, I'm the most popular. And I have 12 months to reach the other people who and I'm pretty confident even if you interview in the polls that have tested their opinions, nobody really is thrilled about either of the people that I'm running against. So I would say those are the 2 weakest candidates for president from major parties in recent decades, and so I feel very good about my chances.
You know the history of independent candidates in this country. They're not the best. They usually suck off support from Republicans or Democrats. Where do you see a path to victory?
Well, I'm taking, again, I'm just basing this not on my speculation, but on what the polling show and what, the analysis by Politico that showed that my support is coming, a lot of it, and particularly my money, is coming from people who have not given to political campaigns before. So I think I have a lot of inactive people, and I think when people actually see me, I have not been popular with the mainstream media in this country for several years. I've had tens of thousands of stories done about me. Virtually all of them have been negative. And most of them, virtually all of them, mischaracterize my position on a variety of issues. And what we find is that when people who have very negative opinions about me actually see me speak in long-form interviews, et cetera, that they come away, that I have a very high conversion rate. So our challenge, I think, Jason, is we haven't done any advertising yet. I think when we start advertising that we're going to capture a lot of those people right now who don't know where else to go. And I think there's a large pool of people who are not enthusiastic about either the candidates. The polls show the majority of Americans do not want to vote for the 2 other candidates.
The polls in battleground states are where you're ahead right now. Have you looked out at the map and said there are any must-win states? We've got to get these states. We've got to concentrate in these areas.
I think we've done analysis. I mean, we have extensive spreadsheets. I have to get 270 electoral votes. The way that the rules work is it's not that you don't need a majority, you need a plurality in order to get, and it's winner take all. So all I have to get in a lot of these states is probably 37, 38% of the vote, and I will win all the electoral votes. So there are many, many different paths for me reaching 270, which is the magic number that will make me president. And you know, you can do that with the big, what you call the, you know, the big states with a lot of electors. But I can also do it through the little states where you're paying much less, you're making a much smaller investment per voter, and the large states, which are a very populous state where you have to spend a lot more money. So, you know, we're looking at all the different options, and we'll probably try 2 or 3 paths at once.
Does Texas fall into those paths?
Yeah, Texas is a critical state in almost any calculation.
A lot of electors here. How challenging do you think it's going to be, Mr. Kennedy, to get on the ballot in all 50 states?
I think it's going to be very challenging, but I'm 100% confident we can do it.
In the past, we've seen, you know, both parties throw up lawsuits against independent candidates trying to keep people off. I mean, do you expect to encounter that?
Yes, we expect to encounter a lot of resistance from both of the political parties. But we're already, you know, we have 250,000 volunteers, which is more than any other candidate. And we're, you know, the states that we're allowed right now to begin collecting ballots in, we're way ahead of our metrics. So I'm pretty confident that we're going to be able to do it.
Coming out of the horse race for a moment and looking at politics, what are the 2 biggest, most urgent, pressing issues facing this country right now, in your opinion?
I think the wars are most important, and also the destruction of the middle class in this country, the price of housing particularly, you know, the fact that we have a whole generation of kids that are not going to get into housing, who have lost, the poll shows, lost faith in our country, lost hope in their future. And it's really important, and that's one of the things I'm going to do, is I'm going to get that generation into homes.
How do you do that?
Well, we have a lot of different programs, but one of them is to issue a 3% mortgage and not without driving this country further into debt, but by getting the U.S. government to co-sign those mortgages and then financing them with treasury bills that are sold, that are tax-free at 3% interest, so the market will pay for them. But we need to get this generation into homes because our economy is based upon an ownership economy, and if you own a home, you can get equity and you have access then to capital, and if you have an entrepreneurial impulse, you can pursue it. And we need that kind of entrepreneurial ferment if we're going to recover our economy and reindustrialize. Then the other issue that I would say that I'm very much focused on is the chronic disease epidemic in children. When my uncle was president, only 6% of Americans had chronic disease. 6% were overweight. Today, 42% are obese, 75% are overweight, and at least 60% have chronic disease. These are neurological diseases, autoimmune diseases that we never saw when I was a kid, and allergic diseases. And those diseases are coming from toxic exposures, and we need to eliminate them. And I'm going to do that as president. I'm going to, get us a safe food supply in this country, and I'm going to reduce the exposures and the chronic disease epidemic.
2 last questions here. Texas has a lot of independent voters. We're known as a red state, but there are a lot of independent voters here. Donald Trump won the state narrowly in the last election in 2020. How much should we expect to see you here in Texas? Because you've been here a number of times already.
Yeah, you're going to see a lot of me here in Texas, and I've already been to a lot of the major cities. I'm going to be in every area of the state. I'll be in the Rio Grande Valley. I'll be in East Texas, West Texas, all over the Panhandle, etc.
I want to ask you about something that's kind of gone viral here. You've leaned into that barefoot video on an American Airlines plane, Americans based here in North Texas. And you had your own little response to TMZ the other day on that flight to Dallas. Well, why were your shoes off?
I don't like wearing shoes. I never have.
You have them on in this interview, though, here.
I know, it's painful. I was going to take them off, and I don't want another video out there right now.
Mr. Kennedy, thank you for the time. We appreciate it, sir.
Thank you very much. I don't even need to win majorities. I just need to get up to about 37%.
On a Wednesday night in Columbia, South Carolina, more than 100 voters line up to meet a presidential long shot.
I'm disgusted with the two-party system, okay? I really am. It doesn't work for anyone.
There's just too much conflict. There's too much fighting. There's too much arguing.
Mr. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
The candidate has name recognition that would make most politicians jealous. But one thing he doesn't have is the support of a party, and he doesn't want it.
I think people are tired of the parties. I think they're tired of the corporate control of the parties. They're tired of the tribalism. They're tired of the vitriol. They're tired of the villainization, and they want, a common sense person who actually is going to find common ground among Americans and lead the country.
In the crowd, we hear that echo from his supporters.
Everybody is at each other's throats, and I'm tired of it. There's too many more important things happening in the world right now that we need to be focusing on.
Political parties have always been sort of the bane of American politics.
Jimmy Williams considers himself a Democrat, but has voted and worked for people on both sides of the aisle.
What I can tell you is that Kennedy, that's caught some fire because I think people are just sick and tired of the two political parties, Democrats versus Republicans, all day long.
Still, Williams won't pull the lever for Kennedy or any other third-party candidate in a national election.
The parties are too powerful. I hate to say it. The Republican Party is very powerful. The Democratic Party is very powerful. They control collectively over 60% of the vote. The question is when can you appeal to either of those two as someone from outside of the swamp, if you will? I can't think of a single person in the world that can do that.
It is a battle royale between two dramatically weakened presidential candidates.
Cal Jilson is a professor at SMU.
This group, and they'd fight.
And a leading expert on presidential politics.
We're going to ask them to take urgent action.
He says Biden and Trump both have huge question marks. Yet Jilson doesn't see any third-party candidate being able to mount a successful challenge because the deck is stacked.
All the rules governing the American electoral and party system are written by elected Democrats and Republicans. They write the rules to protect themselves against successful third-party, minor party challenges.
That doesn't mean he and millions of others wouldn't like to see another option.
Yes, we would be better served, and Americans would be happier with a parliamentary system in which they had a range of 3, 4, 5, 6 parties that better fit their ideology, their partisanship, their beliefs than these two major parties we have now. But getting from here to there is traversing a great ravine that we don't know how to get across.
But that isn't keeping Robert F. Kennedy Jr. from making the rounds, campaigning, and trying to woo voters.
America, American politics, is a drunk driver behind the wheel, and we're all just the collateral damage.
The Democrats and Republicans are playing the same damn game. We need somebody in the middle to keep them honest.
And that's exactly what Kennedy is counting on.
I intend to spoil the race for both of them and win the race myself. And I'll be dirt both of them in a nice way.
Could a Kennedy get back into the White House?
Now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark.
This Kennedy wouldn't be able to finish his first term as president.
Spectators waiting their chance to see the president as he...
60 years ago, 3 gunshots shook America to its core.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
It was the third bullet that killed President John F. Kennedy.
President Kennedy assassinated. It's official now. The president is dead.
One of America's most popular presidents.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
What happened on November 22nd, 1963, moved the name of Kennedy from that of history into myth and legend. The name still carries a certain sort of magic, a certain nostalgia, a certain sense of hope and opportunity that is not always present in American politics today.
But 60 years on, another Kennedy is making political waves, JFK's nephew, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
This country is ready for a history-making change.
He's launched a presidential bid as an independent and is gaining traction.
At this point, he's polling quite highly, in part because he's a Kennedy.
A recent poll, which proposed a hypothetical three-person race, found Kennedy not far behind the Republican and Democrat frontrunners.
And a lot of this is dissatisfaction on the part of many Americans with one or the other of the major party candidates. There aren't that many impassioned Joe Biden supporters, and there are a lot of people really afraid of what would happen if Donald J. Trump returned to the White House as the 47th president. So there's a fear factor in here.
He's running on a platform of, among other things, rebuilding the economy, reducing the US military presence overseas, and increasing government transparency. Thus is RFK Jr. anything like his famous uncle. So he's a controversial figure. He's promoted misinformation about vaccinations.
The minute they hand you that vaccine passport, every right that you have is transformed into a privilege contingent upon your obedience to arbitrary government dictates.
However, not just in COVID. In 2019, Samoa struggled to contain a deadly measles outbreak, made worse by vaccine hesitancy.
But One News has learned of a high-level anti-vax meeting organised in Samoa in June, just before this deadly measles outbreak. A US embassy staff member facilitated a meeting between vaccination critic Robert Kennedy Jr., invited here for Samoa's independence celebrations.
His controversial views used to appease people on the left. He was an environmentalist. He worked for the rights of indigenous people and the like. And so people say, well, that's our kind of guy. More recently, however, his comments about public health, about conspiracies behind vaccines, his attitude towards the COVID pandemic and the like, have fed those who like to think in terms of conspiracies. They tend to be on the right side of American politics. Many of Robert Kennedy Jr.'s own family have come out against what he thinks about certain policies.
He's trading in on Camelot, celebrity, conspiracy theories, and conflict for personal gain and fame. I've listened to him. I know him. I have no idea why anyone thinks he should be president. What I do know is his candidacy is an embarrassment.
I don't think he has any chance of being back in the White House except as a guest. But I do think in certain cases he might, in closely contested states, throw the election one way or the other, where people who would normally vote for one of the two major candidates would decide, I don't like either one of them, I'm going to vote for Kennedy as a protest vote. Let the chips fall where they may.
A controversial candidate in a presidential race that's rapidly heating up.
Black voters are flocking to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., according to a recent New York Times Siena College survey. It found RFK Jr. polling at 28% among black voters in battleground states, compared to 50% for Joe Biden and 13% for Donald Trump. That's in a three-way hypothetical matchup.
Left-leaning commentators of MSNBC's Morning Joe, Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski, brushed off Biden's weakening grip on the black vote, writing off the current polls as merely a snapshot. Here's a clip from the morning show yesterday.
Let's talk about these polls that taken a year out from the election that
Yeah, I would say don't really mean anything on who's going to ultimately win, but if I were...
What are they, a snapshot into...
Snapshot of where people are right now, but if I were on the Biden campaign or any campaign that got these type of polls, I'd love them because I would be using them to get everybody working from top to bottom.
Love it or not, Biden's camp is going to have to double their efforts to make up for lost ground with black voters who report being disillusioned with the president. Let's watch.
Now we have tax coming down to programs and different things that are going to be cut directly from our community to pay for illegals. All right, there's a problem with that. We're going to see a overwhelmingly amount of people that we have not seen in 30 years come out to vote. All right, people are being educated on the voter registration piece, how to change their party affiliation, question number 14 on their voter registration form, and people are walking away from the plantation of the Democratic Party once and for all.
So it's funny to hear Joe and Mika say, like, oh, yeah, it's a snapshot. Nothing. Biden's camp must love these poll numbers because it's firing them up to work harder. I mean, the poll, fine, you can just say their poll numbers, whatever. They're very bad in the key battleground states that are going to decide the election. There's a lot of dissatisfaction within the Democratic Party on how Israel has been handled. And you hear from voters, including some minority voters, who are really not thrilled with the job Biden has done so far. So do you think it's as the landscape is as depressing as all that?
I think the landscape is depressing. Black voters and younger voters are the base of the Democratic Party. And Joe Biden's polling numbers right now are bad. There's no way to flip it, remix it, or turn it in any other way. But I do think being a year out of an election cycle points to a few things. One, polls a year out of an election, a national election, don't really tell us that much in general. They've been wrong in multiple elections in the past, up to and including probably, we saw it with Trump. We saw it with Biden in his first race. We saw it with, we've basically seen them be wrong consistently within every election a year out, with the exception of George Walker Bush's. But everyone else has been incorrect. And I think that there's something to be said about that. A lot can happen between now and next November. We didn't know 2 months ago that Israel was going to be fired on. Obviously, there are things that can happen within that time frame. But I think that for Joe Biden, one of the harshest things he has to come to grips with, one is the issue of Republican governors sending migrants to major cities in this country. New York being one, we've seen the backlash that the mayor there is getting. Chicago, my hometown, being one, we've seen the backlash the mayor is getting there as well. And a lot of it is coming from the black community, partially because where are migrants going to be housed? In many cases, they are housed within communities that are already not receiving the funds that they need to, historically divested communities that are already holding on by a thread, communities where their centers, their youth centers and other centers are being transported into migrant shelters, and it's pushing out black youth. There's a lot of frustration at the idea that budgets are being given towards a group that is not American, but also one that is not and has not paid taxes here. So I think that there's a lot of frustration there, be it right or wrong. We just recently saw a Cardi B video come out where she went live and basically castigated not only the president, but also the mayor of New York, and pretty much laid out what I think a lot of Americans, specifically black Americans, are feeling right now. And this administration has to work through those things, because I don't believe that there's going to be a large group of black people that are going to all of a sudden vote for RFK Jr. Nothing on the ground tells us that that's true. But what on the ground is true is that many black voters are thinking about sitting this one out.
Home.
And if they sit this election out, that's essentially voting for whomever the Republican nominee happens to be. And right now, it looks like it'll be Trump.
Yeah, we talked about the Cardi B video yesterday. Brianna and I did. Viewers should go look at that on our YouTube page if you haven't seen it. And she explicitly references exactly what you're describing, the services, the resources for the underprivileged community, for minority voters, those resources being transferred easily overseas, right? There's always more money to spend on Ukraine, on Israel, on foreign policy. Everywhere the money is found. But the perception among a lot of people is that our infrastructure is crumbling, that people are not being taken care of, that the economy is very bad and has been mismanaged. Inflation less of a problem now, but it was a problem, a year and a half ago, and could be again. Just this perception that the job of overseeing the country is not being done well by a president who is very old, is perceived to, you can't hide the fact that he seems very old. He's going to get older every year. I think that's really hurting him. And there's just a lot of frustration about all of that. Now, it is true at the same time that the Democratic Party has done well in the midterms. They did well in the election we just had. There's something enduring about Biden that maybe doesn't get captured in the poll numbers, or some of the attitudes about him you hear online and other places, or the Republicans have just not presented a very compelling alternative vision, or their own dysfunction.
I think it's a mix of both.
Seems that way, but Biden is vulnerable if Republicans...
And Republicans consistently running on abortion restrictions is just a gift to the Democratic Party.
Well, every now and then they detour from that to run on how they actually won the previous election, another really popular issue that people really want to hear a lot about. No, Republicans, I think people want to hear from Republicans on a lot of subjects, on our crime being pretty bad in a lot of places, including D.C., the school system's not serving people well. There was a lot of frustration about the COVID response, obviously, in a lot of blue places. That has faded a bit from memory, which is like thankfully, from a policy perspective, very eager I am to part ways with the blue city policies of the pandemic, but it's not serving Republicans well now because we have moved past. I think if we were in the midst of still having a battle over COVID stuff, honestly, I think Ron DeSantis would have be doing better even against Donald Trump, who the only time you can get his own audience to boo him is when it gets brought up that, well, he was the one who hired Dr. Fauci, and he was the one who shut down everything initially. He said he had no choice, but that's not popular among Republicans, and frankly, very popular among a lot of independent people, which is part of RFK Jr.'s support. But this three-way matchup will be fascinating because RFK Jr. is polling, above 20%, which is not. It's been a long time since we've had a case where someone outside the major two parties is doing that well, and it's going to be a totally different dynamic.
I question a lot of polls at this point, but I question this one specifically as it relates to black voters, because the most consistent and strongest polling of black voters has come from black polling organizations like Hit Strategies. Mm-hmm. When you look at Hit Strategies polling, he's not even on the radar of the majority of black voters in the primary states. And I think that makes a difference. In addition to, again, there are a lot of voters who are very frustrated with the system, very frustrated with the pandemic recovery, who, even though you can acknowledge the infrastructure development plan, the work that the president has done to decrease the cost of prescription drugs, particularly insulin for those who are on Medicare, these things matter. However, people's pocketbook issues also matter. They're watching crisis in their schools. They're watching rising housing costs. They're watching being pushed out of their communities. And I think that there is a level set of frustration that has to be understood by this administration. Also that you can't take the black vote for granted, because if black people sit out, he's done. And I think he recognizes that. So these polls, be it, whether they're factual or not, and that kind of hinges on a lot of things, it does put a laser focus on him specifically with black voters and younger voters. Those are the voters who are going to make or break this election cycle. Republicans aren't worried about getting them because they never get them anyway. However, if they sit back, that is a win for Republicans regardless.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see. And we'll have more Rising right after this.